China-U.S. Comprehensive Economic Dialogue. It takes us every 4 years to remember the name of a new dialogue. But the question really is, are we going to achieve anything substantial this time? I'm going to go Chinese-American, Chinese-American. Okay, so Mr. Yang, very briefly from you.
No, simply because the target for this meeting does not achieve some achievement, but to discuss the plans for the next phase of the economic ties.
Okay, Mr. Glickman, much hope? Big deals or not?
Well, a little, probably not big deals, but a little bit of hope. You got to remember the political context here. In 2016, President Trump was very critical of the Chinese-U.S. relationship. It's also a political year in China with the 19th Party Congress happening in the fall. So just keeping the status quo would be a big accomplishment, avoiding some kind of tit-for-tat trade war. And in the very short term, you've seen some progress in the 100-day talks on issues like beef and poultry, and we'll see if other issues come out as well. But in terms of very big issues for the U.S.-China relationship, I'd be very surprised if you saw much progress this year at all. Professor
Liu, yours?
I think, well, over the 100 days, we already had a early harvest. So it means that after all the changes from the SED into CED, we are really seeing some, some light at the end of the tunnel. So I hope that, with the one-year plan under discussion, particularly to move forward with the BIT, I would really anticipate there's going to be something, if not significant, but rather substantial.
Mr. Paal, are you seeing as much light as Professor Liu just did?
Well, as Professor Glickman said, this is a big contrast. The fact is, the headline of this meeting will probably be, there are no headlines, because we're not having a trade war initiated by the United States against China. I think the administration, for a variety of reasons, is settled into office and discovered that American exports to China, even though they're unbalanced in our overall trade relationship, are growing rapidly, and they depend on China's continued relatively rapid pace of growth to absorb more American exports and therefore maintain more American jobs. So I think the friction has significantly been reduced, and to me that's the headline.
1 month after 100-day plan, 100-day plan, what exactly is it? What have been included in it? How much really it would mean for the bilateral trade ties? We take a look at that. Both sides announced a series of initial actions for this so-called 100-day plan. It covered sectors as agriculture, financial services, and also energy. We have already witnessed the reopening of the Chinese beef market to the United States and the U.S. poultry market as well, and better access for American financial services providers to China. The U.S. also sent representatives to the Belt and Road Forum in May, even though it is not as high level as some people would expect. Having said that, though, let me ask you about this, Professor Liu. Beef, poultry, liquefied natural gas, all of this, will they really change much the trade structure between China and the United States?
Well, the answer is no, because they really take a very insignificant portion of the entire trade volume between China and the United States, and also given the trade gap is almost constantly staying at $300 billion US. But it is really a positive move, and particularly after the White House, is really changing its president. So it's really there to settle the sentiment and also to move in the right constructive direction.
Okay, there is one, as China sees it, a constructive direction, Professor Glickman. That is, why don't you, the United States, export some of the high-tech products to China? Last year, it was 16%, and this year it's dropping even more, only 8% of U.S. products among all the high-tech products imported by China. Things are not doing good. Why don't you just do that, and the trade will really go in balanced?
Well, the issue of high-tech exports is complicated.
Yeah.
The U.S. saves its most sensitive high-technology products for for countries that are its closest allies. And obviously the US and China, while they're both important trading partners, are also strategic competitors. The export control system prevents certain products from going to China now. Maybe that can improve. What I think is really notable, though, in that first 100 days is the US has already made some pretty serious concessions on issues like poultry and natural gas. And the question is, what other concessions could the US make? It's also agreed to go along with the Chinese One Belt, One Road strategy, or at least is allowing it to go forward, as well as another Chinese negotiation with other Asian allies. And that's what makes the U.S. pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership such a big deal. It's lost a lot of the leverage it could have had in gaining a closer relationship with some of the other trading partners in Asia that China really relies upon.
Okay.
So the question is, where else can the U.S. go from here? And I bet not much.
All right. Professor Liu, you probably want to respond to your American colleague. First of all, not exporting high-tech products to China, not as much. Will that make U.S. safer? Will that make U.S. competitive among all the other players in the world? Secondly, about the BRI, does China need a nod from the United States to go ahead with the BRI?
Well, I do not think that can really make the United States safer, because with a staunch partner in Asia can really help them to reduce the cost of maintaining stability around the world, and also given China's history of non-aggression. And on the other side, we also theoretically we see that well, United States as the advanced economy, they should supply more of the technology to a developing country like China. But now it turned out to be a paradox, and well, we are buying more of the agricultural produce, we're buying more of the beef and all that stuff. So it's really theoretically, very intriguing. So in the trade pattern, I should say.
All right. What about the BRI? Does China need a nod from the United States to go ahead with this initiative?
Well, I do not think really China can really make its own decision. So therefore, the long-arm jurisdiction, as the spokesman of the Foreign Affairs says, well, is not really valid to maintain or to contain.
All right, Mr. Yang, if the United States does not export the high-tech products to China, some of the others will, because China every year importing enormous amount of stuff. But the thing is, what about Professor Liu just said, that it's interesting if you look at the structure of China-U.S. trade, that the U.S. is going with the very basic kinds of exports to China, not like a developed economy, but rather, so is there a way to fix this structure, to make it really balanced? What is the key to have the trade balanced?
Well, theoretically and ideally, for balancing the trade, we need to make the pie bigger rather than to cut off the pie smaller. So how to make it bigger? I think high-tech area is the greatest potential. And also for American national interests, the life of high-tech is quite limited. This year you are high-tech, next year no. So the banning or limiting high-tech export to China means should their feet by themselves. So I think reasonable lifting some high-tech restrictions will be very helpful for both of the sides.
All right. Mr. Glickman, you want to respond to your Chinese colleagues briefly?
Well, the U.S. does export all sorts of high technology items and complicated manufactured products to China. That's frankly most of what we make here. A lot of the lower technology manufacturing items have already been lost to China and other competitors. But when you talk about the most sensitive technologies the U.S. produces, there's a lot of concern within the U.S. national security apparatus that that by exporting that to China, we're going to put the U.S. at a competitive disadvantage and in some ways threaten our national security.
All right.
Now, keep in mind, this is limited to a very small number of items that the U.S. produces and sells overseas, and one that's unlikely to make a lot of change or progress on over the next year.
Mr. Paal, you are a China expert. I mean, you've been watching the U.S.-China relations for decades, so let me ask you about this. We do not now concentrate on just small issues. Let's talk about this trend. The trend about how the U.S. sees China when it comes to trade and economic ties. There is the issue of looking at near term. You know, when you think about the beef, when you think about the poultry and things like that. It's something very near term. It's about your political constituency. Everybody knows that. But then there is the long-term vision, but the long-term vision all seems to be concerns and worries. For example, long-term, the United States worry about exporting real high-tech products to China, and that would threaten the US security. So there is very short vision of so-called near term, and also the very concerning and worrying long-term visions people have about China. This interesting combination makes the trade very hard to be readjusted. Mr. Paal.
Well, if you focus just on the bilateral trade, you're going to always end up having discussions about, new market niches for beef and poultry and other things. But these are really rather small. The bulk of American exports is constituted of waste products and paper, waste metals that are reprocessed in China, and agricultural products, soybeans. Every third soybean in America goes to China, and these are the major export products. Where you want to look forward long term, it's harder to make headlines out of this, but it's the efforts to reopen the services market in China that really has the greatest promise. And that's where the Chinese economy is going, into greater dependency on services, more sophisticated financial services. We've been discussing in this period since Trump came to office how to get the credit card people into China. And I went and visited with the credit card representatives in Beijing a month and a half ago or so, and they were very optimistic that the outcome of the first early harvest was going to benefit their position. But we've got a real moving target here in China. Credit cards are going passé. I suspect you spend most of your money on day-to-day things through your cell phone.
That's right.
Through Alipay
Cashless.
or a similar system. And we've got to get in and learn how to do this. We're getting behind on these things. So I think the big picture has got to be in the services trade, not the material trade. Moreover, China's export machine is going to shift. More and more offshore platforms, whether they follow the Belt and Road Initiative or they go off on a purely commercial basis, China's manufacturing is going to be manufacturing somewhere else, and it'll come off the list of things that are in our bilateral trade deficit. And we will look more and more to balance that trade, not with high tech, which the U.S. is already selling about as much high tech as we're going to sell to China. It's an overstated issue. It's a 20-year-old talking point.
Okay.
And it's also been complicated by China's China 2025 initiative, which suggests that China wants to grab some of these technologies to produce them at home, and therefore it's not just national security that's a concern, it's also market security that inhibits the trade in high-tech goods.
You know what? A lot of the things are really 20-year-old talking points, unfortunately, Mr. Paal, because there has been a lack of trust between the two countries to really crack on the really tough issues. So unfortunately, we're still tackling with what we had 20 years ago. And having said that, though, Professor Liu, let me go to you about that. One of the things about China and United States have this mechanism. It's about possibly this mechanism is not just to fix the numbers beautifully, but also manage to help, at least to a certain extent, both sides to take a look at its own economy and its own economic and financial structure and think about how we can improve as a result of this platform by looking at each other. Do you think there is still that kind of momentum, that kind of possibility for China and the United States with this kind of mechanism?
I think yes, and in terms of the dialogue, splitting the SED into 4 tracks, that can really drive the discussion and even negotiation into more in-depth and more deliverables. And I think that a very decisive solution is to have more of the Chinese investment in the United States, because that can really turn made in China into made in the US, or Chinese companies work with the US company in a third country.
Okay.
So that can really mitigate the trade deficit, suffered at least on the book, from China.
And also the financial services. There has been a lot of talk about the opening up China's financial services. We just had the so-called National Financial Conference. It's being held once every 5 years. And this time it's coming up with a super super body for supervision, I guess.
That's true.
So how will all of these changes going on in China in a way impact on the possibilities of discussions between China and the United States? Professor Liu, very briefly from you.
Yeah, I think China and the United States should be really provide more of the transparency in terms of data, in terms of information, so that people can really talk over the same thing.
All right.
And number two is that the businesses need to be motivated to participate more into the discussion instead of only between politicians.
I see. Okay, let's go to Professor Glickman. He was nodding his head while his Chinese colleague was making the point. So, Professor Glickman, go ahead.
Well, I think he made a really good point, and particularly about the bilateral investment relationship between the U.S. and China. There was some progress made in the last administration on improving that relationship. Some of the U.S.'s largest issues in China right now relate to its investors and its investment position there, how companies are treated in China, whether issues around forced technology transfer, intellectual property protection, rule of law issues. And on the flip side, one of China's most significant issues in the U.S. is how it views its investment through the U.S. CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, basically the U.S.'s national security investigations of Chinese investment, that it feels it's being improperly treated for some of those investments. There's a long way for that relationship to grow. In the scheme of investment in the U.S., China is still a small player, but a fast-growing one. It's a much smaller player than a lot of the U.S.'s European investment partners. So there's a lot of room to grow, and as the professor said, that Chinese investment does lead to more manufacturing and more jobs in the U.S. It's something that's politically potentially challenging, but economically could be a very positive development for the U.S.
I see. Having said that, though, gentlemen, there are two fundamental questions that we really need to discuss before we wrap up our show today. One is, what about the ideology when it comes to international trade and economic ties? I mean, Trump administration has been talking about believing in bilateral rather than multilateral, and certainly China has been a new player or even one of those new leaders in the multilateral system. We see also many Chinese proposals in that regard. So if the two do not see eye to eye on this very fundamental ideological issue, can the two really work together on the trade and economic ties between the two bilaterally? Mr. Paal.
Well, there's tremendous potential for bilateral trade investment. I share the preference of quite a few people that we do these things more multilaterally over time, because all of the international trading relationships are so interconnected that doing them bilaterally is taking us backwards. But that's, we've had a failure of our policy elite in this country to explain to the American people repetitively and clearly the benefits of doing these multilateral deals, like the NAFTA agreement, for example. And now we're harvesting the results of years and years of cheap politics, where we complain about this or that effect on the economy and don't try to educate our people in the broader impact of these things. The U.S. should be working multilaterally with China on a host of issues that are the post-Cold War topics that will drive our futures and employ our youth for decades to come. And that's, I wish our vision would go up a bit and we'd aim at those targets.
I see. Professor Glickman, do you agree?
Yes, at least in part. There are some issues where the U.S. and China could be working better and closer together. I think the Chinese involvement in international infrastructure and through increased involvement in the development banks could be a good development in terms of the needs in the world that both China and the U.S. need to address. And I also agree that we're missing the multilateral forum, but in part what we're missing about it is one where the is a core reason why the U.S. and China are at odds. At the end of the day, the U.S. and China have two different views of how national economies should function, and their responsibility around issues like subsidies and rule of law and the amount of influence in the government in the economy. And it's very difficult to see a moment where China changes that behavior, which is the sort of economic status that most economies in the world have, to become a more market-oriented economy, because there's not a lot of impetus for them to do so without the sort of pressure and that can come from a multilateral forum.
Right.
And without something like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I think it's very difficult to see how the U.S. moves on that needle. And if they can't move that needle, it makes it difficult to get some of these other larger issues resolved, at least for U.S. policymakers.
I see your perspective, but what about another question, Mr. Yang here in Beijing? This U.S.-China or China-U.S. comprehensive economic dialogue goes in parallel with the earlier diplomatic and strategic dialogue between China and the United States, security rather, dialogue between China and the United States. And it was based on the fact that the two presidents met in Mar-a-Lago. They had great discussion. They seemed to look at each other's eyes and say, well, this is someone that I'm going to work with and I need to work with in the future. But that, from President Trump's perspective at least, seemed to suggest it has a lot to do with China's capability to put on pressure on DPRK and how much role China will play in that specific issue. But now, it is very clear, China's national interests do not necessarily go 100% hand in hand with every action that the US thinks China should take place. So here's the thing, without that kind of coordination, to a 100% perfect level, as President Trump sees it, will other platforms of China-U.S. relations following Mar-a-Lago be able to achieve their goals, at least with uncertainties in the United States, particularly from the Trump administration? So, Mr. Yang, I want you to help us to understand this from the Chinese side.
Well, from Chinese point of view, we should firstly separate the North Korean cooperation from the cooperation and exchanges on the economic ties, because that is a security issue, although that includes some economic sanction measures relating to the economic part.
But President Trump is all about deals.
Well,
as he said it.
There's a different mindset between American and the Chinese. Let's set aside the differences, difference on the mindset, and the differences of assessment about the sanction effects on pulling North Korea back. And the fact is, the coordination and cooperation and the differences on North Korea issue should not affect the discussions and cooperation on economic fronts.
Mr. Paal, I need to have your words as well. Really, it should, but will it? It should not have much effect, but will it have much effect?
Well, I think we saw in the initial reaction at the time of the security dialogue that the administration felt that China had not performed up to its expectations on the question of North Korea, and therefore the U.S. Initiated an arms sale to Taiwan, trafficking in persons, finding on Chinese behavior in that issue area, and a couple of other areas. They're mixing apples and oranges in ways that I think are highly unproductive and will be frustrating to their long-term objectives. This is a kind of action-reaction psychology that seems to be driving the system right now, not a strategic focus on how to achieve a prioritized set of objectives. And as long as we stay in a reactionary mode, we're going to be disappointed with the results.